class.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. We're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to get right to it. And I hope you have your supplies laid out and ready to go. Like Felicia said, if you have any questions, if something is not clear, post it in the chat and Molly can either help you out directly or she'll send it over to me if it's something that, that I can help you with. So we're going to get to it. So Felicia, if you could spotlight the overhead camera, that would be great. And you can see my desk setting there. So this is the finished artwork. What we've hopefully done previously is transferred our pattern. So I'm going to just share this little tip with you. Whenever I am transferring a pattern, I take a piece of tape and I tape my pattern onto my watercolor paper. That way, if I have to peek underneath or something doesn't get fully transferred, I can just lay the paper back and it's not going to move and I won't have to reline it up. So that's all ready to go. And, you know, if you didn't get a chance to transfer it and you wanted to sketch it on real quick, then go ahead and do that. Or again, you could always just watch us live now and then follow along with the replay on Monday if you prefer. So we're going to just grab any large round brush you like. I would go in between maybe a size 8 to 10, do a 6 if that's a little more comfortable for you. And we are going to start by painting in our ice cream shapes. And I'm going to start with my Derwent Pastel watercolors. Now, these are really smooth. You can see when I put them on there, they have really nice coverage, but they are still sheer like watercolor. They're not as thick and opaque as gouache paint, but if you had gouache, you certainly could use that today. I'm starting with my lightest color, and I'm going to paint the area here that would be this kind of peachy color, but I'm starting with a lighter tone first. And if you want to change the shape of any of your ice creams, or you want to do like maybe a different color, that's totally fine. It's your painting. It should make you happy. So do whatever you like best. Oops, I got in some of the other color, and that's fine because we're going to use both of those colors. I'm just going to divide that space up a little bit so I have some room for a purple ice cream underneath. Making with some of that lighter color. Now, one thing I'll recommend, anytime you have a water-based product, like any sort of watercolor product, whether it's the pastel watercolors, the Inktense, the Graphite, any of those, I recommend you make a little swatch card for them, because it can be really hard to tell what your colors are going to be. Pastels look pretty much the way they're going to look, but when you're dealing with colors that are darker, it's a good idea to always have a swatch card. And I make a little line kind of through my little boxes. When I make a swatch card, I'll put a line of marker underneath so I can see how opaque my my products will be. So that way I'll know, can I cover it up? Can I use it for a highlight, or is it going to be more sheer? It's just really handy to know that sort of thing. So now I'm going to dip into, I'm going to clean my brush off, dip into that kind of medium orange color. So we were in kind of that peach color. Now we're in this kind of like orangey color. And I'm just going to kind of dab some of that color in there and break up the space a bit, so it's a little bit more mottled and natural looking. I'm kind of making almost a little bit of a stripy pattern in there. And now I'm going to dip right into that more reddish, pastel reddish color. It's almost a coral. And I'm going to add some of that in there too, kind of on top or next to where I put that lighter color. Now this area on the side is going to be kind of like where the ice cream is just like smushing up against the edge. So I'm just going to put a little bit of that on the edge. I want my textury strokes to be more around. Like anything that touches the surface, I want to be smooth, but the rest of it I want to be kind of textured. So I'm going to apply it in a stippling motion, which is when you just kind of dot it on there. And please go at your own pace. If it feels like it's going a little fast, you can always catch up in the replay. So so enjoy yourself and go at the pace that you're comfortable. And I'm just going to put a little bit more of that reddish color down towards the bottom where it would be further away from the light and a little bit darker. Now, one thing that I find makes my pastel watercolors even more versatile is to take an Inktense block, one of the antique white Inktense blocks, and I put it in this little area where the sponge usually is on my palette. That way, if I want to highlight something, all I have to do is wet my brush. Now, sometimes I will pre-wet these just to make sure they're ready to go, and I didn't pre-wet this white, but that's a good idea if you want to have a nice white highlight. But say I want to add a little bit of highlight on there while it's still wet, because I want a soft edge, I'll just kind of go in there with that Inktense white and just add it to the edge. And that could also be done with any sort of like a white gouache that you had if you didn't have this product. But you can also buy the Inktense white in a pan like that if you wanted to replace another color, which is handy. But I like all those colors, so I just like sticking that in the edge. You could probably actually put 4 more pans of color if you have some Inktense ones you wanted to add. Inktense works really well with the pastel watercolors. All right, so because that's wet, I'm going to actually skip. I think I'll skip over to this side and work over here. I don't want it to bleed into these 2 pieces here, but I think I can get over here pretty well. And I'm going to take some of this yellow. If you have a hard time getting enough color on your brush, you can spray it with water about 5 minutes before you paint, and that will really help you get that color payout that you might be going for. I'm going to bring this color right down here into the edge a bit. And clean my brush, and I'm going to go for some of this green, this aqua green kind of color. Now, any of the really dark, bright colors we're going to do with our Inktense pencils, and I've got the set of 12 here, so you don't need to have a ton of colors. And the thing I really appreciate about Derwent's products is that they kind of front load the smaller sets with the best colors. So if you're on a budget and you only want, or you're not so sure, do I like these? Do I want to invest in this set? You can start with a small set of a product and have the good colors, have the best colors there, and then you have a really fair shot deciding whether you like a product or not. So the first 12 colors are your really vibrant colors, and you can always water them down if you want them lighter, but you can't make a lighter color darker and brighter if it's not what you want, So while that's wet, something I like to do sometimes is to work wet into wet with a water-soluble pencil. And I'm going to take, I think I'll start off with this apple green, which is a really pale kind of almost like a lime, well, like a Granny Smith apple or kind of like a line. And I'm just kind of scribbling in a little bit because I want to put a little subtle texture. Now, the value of this, meaning how dark or light it is not that much different than the color of that aqua color that we have there, but it does brighten it up a little bit and give it that little bit of a, almost like a lime tint. And like your rainbow sorbet is usually kind of citrusy, so I think that kind of works well to get us that kind of vibe. Nice little texture and color. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this teal green, because it's a little bit more vibrant, and I can go in and add into the kind of the more shadowy areas. I can get a little bit more darker color. And the water from the paint we already applied is activating our paint, so it's nice and bright. Look how easy that is to create texture, to create blending, get all those elements that we want together. Next, I think I will move to the center area. I'm going to do this blue ice cream, but I think I'm going to start with the melty part. And we'll grab some of this teal color that we just used. We're just going to fill this shape right in. Now, luckily, with an opaque watercolor like the pastel, it doesn't float as much as Even if you were using like the Inktense, you'd be using more water. Using less water here, the paint's a little bit thicker, so they're not going to run together quite so bad. So we can start to work next to another color as soon as it starts to just set a little bit. I'm going to grab some of this blue with my dirty brush. I'm just going to blend some of that in there. And I want a soft, untextured effect because I want the texture of glass, which is smooth here for this. And I'm thinking here, I'm going to turn this in. I want this to be a yellow because over here, I didn't really have much of a melt there, but I like that melt that I drew. So I'm going to make that yellow. You'll get used to jumping around a lot in your paintings when you're working with watercolor. Because when something's drying, rather than wait around for it to dry, you can jump and paint something else in. So I'm going to do the yellow, and then I'm going to add some of the green, the aqua green in there. And then I'm going to show you another trick. If you need another color, but you don't have a pan paint of it, but you want it to be smooth and blending. So what I'll do is I'm just going to pick up and take my 2 pencils that I was using, and I'm just going to pick up color from those right with my brush. Now I don't like to do that over the paper because sometimes it spatters, so I'm just going to do that right here. Add some of that in. And a little bit of that darker color too. And if it seems too bold, you can take a little bit more yellow and blend it. Blot my brush off there. I'm just going to see if I can smooth it without adding more yellow, because it's up against the glass and will be nice and smooth. Yeah, I think we need a little more yellow in there though. Now, while those are kind of setting a little bit, I want to go down to the cherries. And this time we're going to do a technique called wet into wet. And we're going to wet the cherry. Just be very careful not to let the water go outside of the perimeter of the fruit here. And because I want a nice cherry red, I'm going to take my my red Inktense pencil here. This is called Poppy Red. And I'm going to pick up some of that color with my brush. Now, if I want a very smooth blend, I prefer to pick up the color off the tip of the brush with my pencil, because that will that way I won't have any lines on my paper. I don't have to worry about denting the paper, coloring too hard, anything like that. I can just paint it on. And I'm just going to let the color just kind of flow. So we get kind of like a bit of a mottled effect. Now, if you want to make a highlight, if it's kind of all whooshed together, maybe you had too much, all you got to do is take your brush, blot it on a paper towel so you remove a bunch of the color, and then you can just kind of go in there and wipe it out. But you have to do this before it dries, because once Inktense dries, it becomes permanent and then you can't take it out. That's why Inktense is so great to use on fabric, because once you've completely saturated and wet the product, it becomes permanent. And this time I'm going to wet both of these cherries. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pick up the pigment from the pencil tip. Now, one thing I want to just make you aware of, if you're doing this and getting the tip of your pencil wet, you don't want to sharpen it until it dries again, because then you could break the lead off. It could damage the pencil, and you don't want to damage your pencil. So just make sure it's fully dry before you go to sharpen it. And just know, if you go to color with it before it's dry again, you could end up getting a much darker line than you anticipate. These are really fun if you like to watercolor, because you can do your first layers with the Inktense and let it dry, and then you can go over it with watercolor or other water-based media, and you don't have to worry about losing any of your original layer. I put 2 little highlights on the side because the roundness of the cherries, I wanted to show that. Now I don't want to do the stems yet because that red will just slide up into the stems. So I'm going to wait a bit on that. Now you can get a really smooth effect with your Inktense pencils by coloring, but you just want to go really light, especially with this one, because remember we just used that into the wet wash, and you get a lot more pigment than you probably realize when you do this, so you don't want to put too much down. But the nice thing about this is that if you're strapped for time, you can always put down your color when you have the time, and then maybe you don't have time to add water. You can do all your coloring and then you can add the water later, which is really handy if you want to be working like at a doctor's office or sitting in your car waiting to pick up the kids, anything like that. So I did the apple green, a little bit of leaf green for shading, and I am going to put a little bit of that teal green in because I like to cross-pollinate my colors. I use that color up here, so I want to use it down here because that's going to make everything kind of agree color-wise and feel really coordinated. You don't need a lot of water when you are reactivating, so I'm going to just kind of blot my brush off a little bit. You can use a smaller brush as well because a smaller brush isn't going to carry quite as much water. So I usually give the advice of use the biggest brush that you're comfortable using and that you can handle, because if you putter around with brushes that are too small, it can take a lot longer and your work can look fussy. So if you just get in the habit of using the biggest one that you can comfortably manage, you'll be a faster painter and you'll be a more skilled painter because you'll learn good brush technique. Now you can kind of see a little bit of that texture in there of the paper from where we colored it. So that's why I wanted to show you both ways so you could get the effect that you want. And we'll just let that dry. All right, now we're going to go back to this ice cream here, and we're going to go in with our aqua color. I love how easily that reacts. And we're going to do kind of like a little swirly pattern in here. And if you have some like rough edges, I think that's great. Let the edges be a little rough on the non-melty touching the glass bits, because then it looks kind of natural. I think I'm going to make this one come around more like my original drawing did, and I'll fill that in with something else. If you get any ideas as you're working and you're like, I wish it went this way, then paint it the way you want it. Then I'm going to take the darker blue here. That's kind of more of like kind of like a country blue, I'd say. I'm going to fill in between. I'm not worried about any of the shadows or highlights or anything on the bowl itself, because we're going to do that later. You actually could even leave the bowl kind of blank and just, you know, freehand all your ice cream in. Sometimes we change our mind, like what we'd want to do. Bring that under there. And now I am going to go in with my sea blue Inktense pencil here. And I'm going to start adding some texture. And remember, you don't want the texture on the melty part. It's only on the ice cream part. And if your paper is drying up too fast, because I know we all live in different areas, and you may be somewhere where you've got a really hot climate, you can always dip it just very quickly and try to only get the lead. Actually, safest way to do this is to put a drop of water on your palette. Just kind of make yourself like a little drop there, and then go in with a tip like that. So that way you're not dipping it right in your water. There's no way you're going to get that on the wood. You don't want the wood to get wet when you are doing that. You only want the water on the lead itself. So making a little drop on your palette's the best way. And then you can get that nice, stippled effect. And if it gets too dark, you can just kind of soften it with a brush. So don't worry about it if it gets a little too aggressive looking. I like to do a combination of stipples and scribbles to get my texture. And we'll do the same with the sea green. I mean the teal green. Basically want a contrast between the texture of the scoops and the melted areas. All right, I think we've got the purple here, but I think I'm going to draw the purple around a little bit there. I think that would look good. Plus purple next to the yellow, I think will look really nice. I'll make it pop. I'm going to start off with the one that's a little bit pinkier. It's more of like a, let me see, I think it's orchid pink. And I'm going to start just by filling in the area, and then I'll add on top of that. I think I'll have this part be kind of smooth. I like to use a golden taklon style brush for these paints rather than a really soft natural hair brush, because it's a little less absorbent and it can help activate the pigments a little bit better. And I don't think you want to have like a super ton of water on these paints because, well, at least for this technique, because it's almost like a cross between gouache and watercolor. It's kind of like in between there. You can use it both ways, really. All right, so I'm thinking about where I want kind of some melty ice cream to be. I think I want this to be melty, and I think I'm just gonna like have a little bit that's a little bit more textured. So I'm gonna dip into, I'm gonna clean my brush off so I get rid of that extra. I'm gonna dip into the purpley color there. It's called lavender, which it's not going to show up a lot because see how the values on those two colors are so similar? They're just one's more pink and one's more blue. This isn't going to show up a ton, but we can use it to create a little bit of difference. I think I need to make this overlap that other ice cream a little bit if I want it to look melty. I got to have it overlap and have a smooth edge. So if I use it thick, it will be opaque enough to do that. And I'm also going to get some of that blue, that darker blue there, the cornflower blue. If you already have Inktense blocks or Inktense pan paints, you might enjoy this pastel range because the formulation of them feels very similar and they work really well together. And now I'm stippling on with that darker blue for texture, but I'm stopping where I'm going to have the melty color. I think I might maybe add a little texture up here. I'm just trying to figure out where I want it to be more of a scoop and where I want it to be more of melt. I think I like that. And then I can add a little bit of that color into the melty bit. I know it looks kind of patchworky and harsh right now, but when we put the like the highlights and shadows on the bowl, it's going to look much more natural. You got to do the hot mess phase before you have the polished look. All right, and because that color's on the bottom, we are going to see some of those colors reflected into the stem of our bowl here. So I am going to grab some of the purple here. Just kind of pull it in. Now we're going to do our background at the end, mainly because I didn't want to have to wait for a background to dry for us to get to this part. And I know in my background, I'm just going to show you here, I like yellow, or like to go with a really pale yellow, because I feel like it's just, it's really easy to layer on top of if you want to. It's not really harsh. But if you decide that I think I want the background to be white, then don't add any of the yellow into the stem. But I'm going to add a little yellow into the stem here because I know I'm going to do my background yellow. But if you're going to keep your background white, then you'll want to just skip that. But just want to let you know so you have the option to do either or. And I'm just going to throw some of that in here. I don't want the purple and yellow to really mix because then they'll get kind of muddy. And I think that's really all I need to do to that right now. All right, so now we have the spoon up here, and we're going to start by base coating that with this lighter gray color. And I'm going to turn mine around. It's just a little easier so I don't lay my hand down in the painting, so feel free to do that if you like. And because on the spoon, I'm going to want sharp reflection so it looks metally, I'm going to want to let that dry before I go in to put my, my darker colors on top, or at least set up a little bit. Now I also want to paint the cherry and little mint leaf up here. So I'm going to do that while I have this upside down. Again, I don't want to lay my hand in it, so that's why I'm doing it this way. So this time, let's try coloring the cherry in. But this time we're only going to put our color where we want the darker tones. So I want the darker tones on the bottom and up the edges. And then I want it a little bit darker here in this pit. Now, because I don't want to put too much water in there, I'm going to go for a smaller brush. If you don't have a smaller brush, that's fine. Just kind of blot off the extra water. So I'm just taking this, I think it's a number 4 round. You could do anywhere between like really whatever size you're comfortable with. If you want to do a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, it doesn't much matter. It's up to you. But I'm doing this so I don't introduce a bunch of water and then have it bleed into the other color there, that green that's just a little damp still. All right, I'm going to activate my darkest areas. Then I'm going to pick up a little bit of water. You can make more. You could spray your palette with water and just pick up from there if you want to. I just dipped mine in my water bucket. You can see here already how that Inktense pencil wants to become permanent. So you got to work kind of quickly when you do this if you want to blend something out to a lighter color, because as soon as it starts to dry, it's going to be permanent. And if you live in a warm area, that's going to dry quicker than it does up here in Maine, where it's pretty humid and not as hot as other places. Now, if you're like, oh, I wish I put more color in, this is where you'd want to go and you'd want to lift off the pencil. If I went in and colored with that, I would have lines that I wouldn't be able to dissolve. But if I go in and I just pick it up from the tip, I'm going to have lots of control. It's just really important to know these different techniques so that you can find exactly what you want. Now, when I rinse my brush off, a lot of times I'll take my fingers, they'll go like that. And what I'm doing there is I'm taking any drops that are on the brush off of my brush, because those little beads of water, if they were to slide down my brush when I was doing this, it would get really messy because it would flood it with water. It would probably bleed into my other things, and it's not what I want. So just wanted to explain that. You can do that with a rag too. It's probably better to do with a rag rather than your hands in case you have like lotion on or something, but it works. And then let's also color our little mint leaves. I'm going to use those 3 greens again that are in the set of 12. We've got our darkest color, which first I'm going to go over the whole thing with my lighter green, the apple green. Very, very light pressure. Then I'm going to go in with the leaf green. And then I'm going to finish up with the teal green. And this one's nice and sharp. I can get into the nooks and crannies there, really get that color in. So I get some nice shadow and contrast there. And we'll go in with our little brush and we will blend it all out. Now I have my outline nice and dark so you'll be able to see it on camera. But when you're working like this at home, you don't have to have your outline that dark. You just need it dark enough that you can see it. So keep that in mind. And then you'll end up with a much more sophisticated look. You won't have a really dark outline. Another thing you could do though, is if you found that like you didn't have enough contrast, or maybe it just felt like your edges were a little soft or just didn't seem very neat, you can always go over them with a waterproof pen or any sort of black marker. The Derwent line makers work really well for that. They are a pen that you can use underneath watercolor or over watercolor or under marker or over alcohol marker. So it's alcohol marker proof and watercolor proof, which is really nice. So we're just going to let that dry, and I'm just going to turn this around. Oh, we can also do our stem with a leaf green. Do we have any questions, Molly?
No, not so far. We've been able to handle most of them in the chat. So,
nice.
Great, Lindsay.
Oh, thanks.
I actually had one that just came to me asking if they could use a hairdryer or maybe a heat gun to dry it faster.
Sure, absolutely. It's not going to hurt anything here. I use mine all the time. And I just did leaf green on these little stems too while I was at it. All right. In fact, why don't we give this a real quick blast? Now this is just a, you can find these at Michael's. This is, they're no longer white, they're now black, but this is by Ranger. It's a heat tool. It looks like a hairdryer, but it doesn't blow air, it just blows the heat, but a hairdryer is absolutely fine. You don't need to buy something special just to dry your paper. I don't recommend using this on acrylic paint if you also like to paint with acrylics, because it's too hot and it will blister it. So if you're someone who paints in both media, then I would say just get a hairdryer. That way you don't have to worry about accidentally using the wrong thing. And I also recommend you hit the back side of your paper as well, because that prevents warping. Now that's not bone dry, but it's definitely dry enough. Now at this point, I'll look and I'll say, does anything need to be a little bit darker? And looking at the cherries, I do want the cherries a little bit darker, and I think I actually want to have a mix of colors. And I want to use the magenta and the poppy red, or is it fuchsia or magenta? Fuchsia. So something I'll sometimes do is I'll scribble my color onto a palette. or onto a piece of masking tape. That works really well because the masking tape has a little bit of grit, but I don't need too much of it. So I think this is going to work just fine for me. And I'm just going to go in and add a little bit of shading because it just seems a little light to me. Maybe I'll just take a little bit off the tips of those as well. Don't be afraid to mix your color. The smaller the set that you have, the more likely you're going to have to mix. But the more mixing you do, the better artist you become. So don't feel like if you have a smaller set and you have to mix colors that you are somehow inferior. Not at all. In fact, you're going to learn better and you are going to learn faster. So there's nothing wrong in that. There's no shame in that game at all. But I totally understand if you like to have every color because it's nice to have every color and it does save some time. I'm putting in my shadows where I want there to be some kind of like darker reflections. Now you can blend it out or not. If you don't blend it out, you're going to have more of a shine to it, kind of how cherries are just kind of naturally shiny. So I think I'm going to not blend mine out and leave it kind of harsh like that. But it's totally up to you. You can do whatever you like. It's your painting. It's your world. And you might think, no, mine was dark enough to begin with. I don't need to do any of that. So you don't, and that's fine too. I like to have that little shadow in between, like the sides of the pit, kind of how it goes, how it kind of like indents on the side and then gets darker at the edge. I like that dimension. I think I might just have enough. I might have to get a little bit more, but maybe I have enough. A good rule of thumb is thinking about how, like having everything kind of the same level of doneness, but maybe a little bit more detail in your focal point. Because if you work on one section of a painting and you get it super, super refined and super detailed, then you're going to find that you'll have to refine and detail other areas more because they won't match. If you detail everything too much, then it gets flat. But you do want them kind of in a scale where they have similar levels of refinement. That one maybe I'll blend out a little bit because I feel like it was a little too light overall. All right. Now we're going to work on our shadows on the bowl and on the ice cream, and we'll do a combination of using the gray from the Pastel set and also using our ink black from the Derwent Inktense. So with the dark gray here, this is called Storm Gray. I'm going to go in and just kind of put some pretty strong strokes. Now, when you've got glass, you've got hard edges. And you want to make sure that your paper is dry. So if you still have some damp areas, you want to dry it or just kind of be patient. You could watch me do this section and then do it on your own later or paint along with a replay later and get those portions done at that time. Try to just kind of move your whole arm as you go. So I'm moving my whole arm from the shoulder. If you can, I know not everyone can get that range of motion, but if you can, it's going to give you a real good advantage when you're doing glass like that. Just get those reflections and refractions going. And I am working with the number 4 round. This number 4 round really kind of feels more like a 2 or 3 to me. So whatever feels comfortable to you. There's no art police that's gonna arrest you for using the wrong size brush. Now here I am kind of just moving from my wrist, and you can see I don't get quite a nice line. but I can't. A lot of times I like to drag my arm across my table, but I know I'm going to smear right through that cherry. So I'm going to try to like just pull it from the wrist motion, which means I have to do it in shorter strokes. I'm turning it because I don't want to drag my hand through the painting. So I'm going to try to go really fine and then like bring it up a little bit thicker as I come up the side of the vase, or the bowl rather. If you have to like stop, then try to taper it down to not much, and then you can reload if you need to, and then you can readjust, and then you can kind of catch up. You kind of backtrack a little bit, kind of like you're sewing and you ran out of thread and you have to go back. You're going to backtrack over what you've already sewn a little bit. At least that's what I do. I'm not a seamstress, but that's how I deal with that. Now across the top, I don't mind if that line's a little broken, and I almost want to get like a little double thickness going here. So I'm going to do another little line underneath. And I'll just kind of go until I can lift it off the paper. Because with glass, you don't see like outlines really. You're seeing how light interacts with it, but it's going to, your lines are going to come and go and stop and start. Just kind of just here and there lines. That way you don't have to be perfect either. Oh, let's do the spoon while we're at it. A lot of times I'll flip my reference over right while I'm doing it. I'm just going to scoot this over so you can kind of see the edge of that spoon. If you ever get stuck, turn your painting and your reference upside down. That helps so much. It gets your brain in a different way of thinking. I'm going to go and do this kind of reflection in the center where you can see the texture of the spoon. And go on the edge a little bit just to outline the side of it. And then, actually I think I'll let that dry up a little bit. And I'm going to deepen the color on that cherry a little bit too, I think. Do my same color I mixed for the fuchsia plus the poppy red, add a little bit more color to this guy. Usually get a little bit of a shift when it dries. And I think I'm going to do the same thing just to kind of smooth out this. Take a little bit of the leaf green from the tip of this pencil. And just kind of paint over it to smooth it out a little bit.
And is this Felicia? I just want to confirm, what was that color you used on the lines, or the darker color you used?
It was the Storm Gray, and right there on our palette. It's right here. I think I've got this in. Yeah, I've got this in the normal range. Storm Gray. So it's a second gray in from the end.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. We're also going to use some ink black in a minute from the pencils. So. All right. All right. One thing I recommend doing, if you're using a white Inktense product like the Inktense block that I have here, and you can also use white gouache or a paint pen. And sometimes I like to have all three because a pen can be easier to deal with. But I like to add water to my block there to really get it ready to go and make it nice and opaque. Now you can also use a gel pen, and if you want a really fine line, and that works well too. So I'll just kind of show you the difference between using the gel pen or using a using the Inktense block. So here I'm just going to take my gel pen. Now, the gel pen's going to work best for skinnier lines. So if you find that you want to add a really thick line, the gel pen could be a little tedious and look a little bit I don't know, just kind of look a little bit rough, but it does give you a really nice thin line. It's really nice for these little kind of outline type highlights on the cherries. And it's certainly fast and convenient to have a little gel pen. Sometimes you have to go over it a couple of times if you find that you're just not getting the opacity that you want, and that's fine. Just let it dry and go over it. Something you also might notice with a gel pen is that you could get some leaching, which is when your color kind of leaches up. Generally, you don't get that with Inktense because the Inktense is permanent, but if that happens, then let it dry and go over it again. I'm just making sure I have everything dry here before I try. If you go over a pen and the paper is damp, it can ruin your pen. So you do want to make sure things are dry. But if you want to like do a highlight on a stem, I do recommend that you have the pen, or if you're trying to do like veins on a leaf or something, the pen is going to be a lot easier to control. So I would just kind of match it with your use. But if you want something a little bit thicker, then using either the Inktense pan paint in antique white or the Inktense block works really good. The Inktense pencil in white is not that opaque, so I don't find I use my pencil version of that very much for that reason. I do find the formulations to be just a little bit different depending on the product you're using. The blocks and the pans are very similar though. So I want to put a nice big white highlight along the edge. I'm getting my arm into position so I'll be able to move the whole arm. I am going to start here at the edge and just drag it across. I think I need more paint though. There we go. And it's good to have these taklon brushes because they will help you dig up the color a little bit. I'm going to go across the top ridge. And put another one over here. And I might need to layer this up after it dries, just give it another layer if I'm not getting the opacity that I want. So don't fret if it looks a little too translucent. You can always layer it up. If you want to highlight a little bit of the ice cream where it's touching the glass, you want to get the edges, make the edges stand out a little bit, you can do that. I wouldn't layer up the highlight on the edges of the melted ice cream because that will be too, I think that will be too bright. I would only add another layer over the glass, the really shiny glass areas, because otherwise it will be a little bit too much, I think. So now I'm going to take the black pencil here. This is the ink black from Derwent Inktense. And I'm going to do a couple things. First thing I'm going to do is actually give a really soft shadow. Now, because Inktense is permanent once you add water to it, I can put shadows underneath these cherries and underneath the bowl, liquefy them, and then if I go over with a watercolor background, this isn't going to get muddy. It's not going to lift up that black. So as long as you fully reactivate your Inktense product, you can layer over it without it reactivating and getting muddy. If I was using a regular watercolor pencil, I would not do this till I had the background in. I just wanted to be clear because I know sometimes you're waiting for your order to come. Oh, it's not here in class. It's class time, and you've got watercolor pencils. So if you're using watercolor pencils, you want to wait if you're going to put a background in. And the reason we're using this black is because we are going to use it in some other areas. Otherwise, I would say just use that storm gray. But because we're going to add some black to our painting, it's okay to put it here. And just make sure you get all of those granules dissolved, because if you don't dissolve them, then they will reactivate when you put that background in, if you choose to put a background in. I'm not worried about the stems here. I'm going to add a gel pen highlight to them once they're dry. So just try to get a smooth. Switch to my bigger brush. And I'm putting a background in, so I'm not going to be too particular about how smooth I get that shadow. I can be maybe pretty rough with it, actually. If you get it too dark, you can lift it off while it's still wet, but once it dries, it's going to be there. I'm balancing out a little shadow over here. Okay, so now I want to use some of this black on the picture itself. I'm going to add some of the darkest refractions and reflections, and I want to have a dark one here at the bottom of the spoon. Now, if I'm going to do the background in there, I want to reactivate this, because if I try to paint a background around and I've just put this black in there, then it's going to definitely get muddy in the background. So just kind of keep that in mind. You can always do this step with the black after if you're nervous, after you put a background in, or you don't have to put a background in. That's your choice. When you activate them, the colors do get stronger. Having those hard edges makes it look shiny. And we'll put some highlights on there too. We just want to let it dry first. I'm going to do a little bit of dark here under the bowl on this glass. And also just kind of down here over that darker shadow that I can blend into the shadow. And then after that, I'll use a paintbrush and pick up my black from the pencil, because I want to be absolutely sure it's going to be activated. And if you follow along with replay, you can always do your background, let that completely dry, and then go in and do the lesson as we're doing it. So I did a time lapse when I designed this project. I filmed it and I did a time lapse and I put it on my YouTube channel. So if you need a little refresher, you can always check that out as well. Like maybe you painted along with me today, you didn't finish it, or maybe you watched it and then you wanted to paint it on your own. You can always look back at that time lapse as well as the on Michael's channel when they have the real-time version in a couple of days. So now I'm wetting my brush. I'm going to pick up some of that black. If you prefer, you can make a puddle of it on your palette. And this is essentially a black ink once it's dry. So there's no reason you can't use your line makers, fine liners, or what have you to go in and do more of those darker lines. I want a very, very fine line. I could switch to a smaller brush, but I feel pretty comfortable with this one. I'm going to go until I run out of paint, and then I'm just going to lift it off and let that be it. I'm going to start just with the tip of that brush, And I can make it a little bit thicker if I want to as I go, just like I did with the gray. All right, I don't want to have do too much there. And I'm going to do some final highlights. Let's see what I can do with the block here. Get up a nice big amount of color. And I'm going to put some highlights right on the spoon. I'm going to go over my highlights on the side there. Make sure they're nice and bold. Now, because I want a little bit of a like a kind of icy texture on the sorbet itself, I am going to use my gel pen and just kind of do some stippling. I'll do some bigger stipples with the Inktense white block. The nice thing about if you're a watercolorist and you like to carry white in your palette, you can break off a piece of that and put it in your watercolor palette and it doesn't crack and fall out. Like sometimes white gouache tends to like shrink up and crack out of your palette, but you can break off a piece of the Inktense block and throw that in your palette and it's not going to crack and you're not going to have that issue. So it's just it's nice. I buy them in bulk, just the white ones. So I always have one ready to stick in a palette or for when I use one for my set. All right, now I know we're just about out of time here. It's 3 o'clock on the dot. So I'm really quickly going to show you how I did the background. Don't rush it. If your paper's wet at all, just let it dry. But I'm just going to show you. Yeah. I think Felicia's helping me teach a class today. I'm just going to wet this real quick with some water. I'm going to be careful not to wet over the I'm going to try not to wet over my subject. I'm just going to try to get the background here. And I think that's pretty good. Because your paint's only going to go where the paper's wet. So whenever you got to put a background in and you're trying to avoid a certain area, just wet the area you want your paint to go in. And then I'm going to go back to this large round. I'm going to go in with my yellow, really wet that brush. I want it to be really juicy. And I'm just going to fill in here. And that's going to soften up any of the shadowy colors I put in there too, because it's going to be a little bit translucent. It's going to have a little bit of opacity. And this color is so light, the value is not that different. So if you don't go right up to the area, to the subject, it's not going to stand out like a sore thumb or anything. And I'm going to keep it nice and patchy. I'm going to go as fast as I can so that I don't keep you guys too late. I know we're at 3 o'clock now, so I don't want to overstay my welcome here. I'm going to go right over that black. Of course, I'm doing it last because just in case there was a granule that didn't get activated, I'm doing the areas that have the black and the shadow last. But you can see that it's so easy. It's almost like you're tinting a photo. In fact, you could do a painting just in the Derwent Inktense ink black and do all your shading, and then you could just tint it with your colors, and it would give you that kind of vintage photo look that would be so pretty. So because I like the texture, what I'm going to do is take some of these colors that I've used. I'm just going to kind of put my hand over the bowl of ice cream and just kind of try to flick this into the background. Now, if you do get a splash where you don't want it, just blot it real quick, and you can always go over it if you need to. So, don't fret. Art's fun. Don't worry about anything. And it's a great way to get any of those colors that you've used. Maybe a color that you wish you could have used more. It's a great way to get a little bit more of that color in there. And you can like throw any of that color into the stem of the bowl as well. And I think I'll do some of this color. That's kind of pretty, that orchid. And there, that does it. Okay, I want to thank you all for joining us today. If you followed along and made this project, I would love to see what you made. All you have to do is tag me. I'm at Lindsay Wyrick on Instagram. You can also use the hashtag MakeItWithMichaels, and you can tag Derwent at DerwentArt_US. I think I got that right. Did I get that right, Molly, or did I say it wrong?
No, you got it right.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for spending part of your day. If you want to hold your artwork up so we can all just kind of look at it real quick, I would love to see it. As long as it's not wet and going to slide off. I don't want anyone to have their paintings drip all over the place. Wow, you guys, this looks so good. Oh my goodness, you guys are painting fast. Look at all these finished artworks. Oh, I'm scrolling through. Oh my goodness, wow. Incredible, guys. I'm so proud of you. Done such a wonderful job. Well, thank you again so much for joining me today. And I can't wait to see what you make. So please do tag me. I'd love to see a full-size picture on a screen where I can zoom in and have a real good look. For Michaels and Derwent, I'm Lindsay Wyrick. Thank you for watching. Until next time, happy crafting. Bye.